Welcome to the Masculine Psychology Podcast, where we answer key questions in dating, relationships, success, and fulfillment, and explore the psychology of masculinity. Now, here's your host, world-renowned therapist and life coach, David Tien.
Welcome to the Masculine Psychology Podcast. I'm David Tien, your host. And in this episode and the next couple episodes, I'm going to be getting into some material that I hope will be very jarring, because I'm going to be contradicting almost all life coaching and self-help. Ordinarily, and in the past, I've been allied with these fields, with these practitioners of life coaching, the self-help industry. However, it's gotten to the point now where I've noticed how toxic their underlying assumptions are. Fortunately, it all boils down to this one thing. And if you just get this one thing right, then it will unlock for you all of the long-term and consistent happiness, fulfillment, and success, and help you to avoid the toxic trap and lie of life coaching. Not all life coaching, of course, because that's an unregulated term. It could really mean anything. But the majority of life coaching, the vast majority of life coaching, suffers from these toxic blind spots. And when I say the lie of life coaching, I'm not saying that they purposely lie or consciously or seek to mislead, but that there's this temptation, this kind of lure that draws people to life coaching. And it's founded on a lie, something that's just not true. And if you take to heart what I'll be covering in this episode and in the next couple of episodes, you'll have the key to your long-term, consistent, long-term lasting, and consistent, as a default, happiness, fulfillment, and success. You'll have the trigger that is the tipping point to take you over the edge, to create that momentum that makes all of the healing and unburdening work and of the growth to consistent long-term happiness and fulfillment and of success, to make that almost effortless. But most people don't get to that tipping point. Because once you get to the tipping point, and once you go over the edge, then you just have this momentum like a ball rolling down a hill, and you'd have to actually exert extra energy to stop it. But most people never make it over the tipping point. They never make it over that hill. They never make it over the peak or to the peak. And the peak here isn't the whole process, but it's in many ways the most important step. It's a necessary step. And if you don't get this step, you won't get the necessary momentum to take you through the rest of the steps. But if you do get this step, then all of the rest of the steps that come after it in your healing and unburdening and growth unfold naturally and relatively quickly. And that's where you get all of the intrinsic enjoyment from the actual process. And then the process becomes an end in itself, rather than how most guys are trying to approach finding happiness and fulfillment through life coaching. It's like a chore. It's like hard work. It's painful. And then they might hear like people like myself and other therapists or other more people further along on their journeys who sincerely describe sadness as a beautiful feeling, or any feeling or any emotion as welcome. Once you take to heart the main concept that I'll be spending this episode on and the next couple episodes focused on, then all of it will make sense to you if you take it to heart, if you embrace it. And if you don't understand or take in this concept that is the focus of these few episodes, and you instead buy into the lie that life coaching sells you. And again, it's not all life coaching, just the vast majority of it. And it's not all self-help, it's just the vast majority of it. And from a psychotherapy perspective, what they engage in is a form of repression. And this type of toxic repression leads to burnouts, is unsustainable, and from a long-term perspective is obviously unhealthy because you're repressing parts of yourself. And in that sense is toxic because it's like a poison that eats away at you. And it's like developing an over-reliance on Red Bull or steroids, where it gives you a boost that maybe for that moment is necessary and a temporary boost for some emergency or crisis. But then if you just rely on that and just hope that you develop a tolerance for it so that you can take on more and more of it. And so life coaching and self-help often loses sight of the original intention of why people were going to it in the first place, and makes it an end in itself to grow for its own sake, and then making yourself feel bad because you're not growing fast enough, and then creating the whole cycle of shame and stress around just growth itself, as an example of many dangerous fallouts of the life coaching line, the self-help trap. All of that is unsustainable and will burn you out. And it's a good thing if it burns you out, because then it forces you to stop. But if you're good at the stuff that life coaching teaches you, then you develop calluses, you get better at repressing, and you fight the burnout. So you go back out for another bout of battle. And obviously, over the long run, this becomes incredibly toxic and is, from a mental health perspective, unhealthy. And perhaps most disturbing for you as an individual is that it blocks and prevents and sabotages your long-term happiness, your long-term and consistent fulfillment, and meaningful, enjoyable success. You might get very toxic, tiring, exhausting success by over-reliance on repression, but it won't be satisfying in itself, and it won't be enjoyable along the way, and it will warp you into a path that you and your parts have a lot of resistance to, for good reason. But instead of listening to the resistance, you just plow over it and repress it through the typical techniques of life coaching and self-help. I'd even throw in there some types of psychotherapy, especially the basic cognitive types of psychotherapy, can veer very closely to and be recruited for the aims and methods of life coaching and catch you in the trap of self-help. I like the word trap for this because we start in the world of self-help with relatively innocent intentions, which are just to improve some area of our lives. And then we find out there's an entire multi-billion-dollar industry built up around helping us do that. And as we get some results from an enjoyable bit of digging, then we're told we're upsold on the next level. And there's always another level, which is in and of itself not a bad thing. It's just, maybe they're just pointing out the fact that there always are levels. But then as you get sucked into this trap, you lose sight of why you were doing it in the first place. And now you're made to feel bad about yourself because you're not good enough in yet another area, which is whatever the heck the life coaching guru or self-help guru you follow tells you ought to be like. And I could fall into the same trap if you don't understand what I'm doing here, and if you don't understand the main concept that I'll be digging into in the next few episodes. It could easily become the same sort of thing. And I've discovered, to my chagrin, some followers or listeners and readers, students who have not noticed the main messages that I've been trying to emphasize over the past few years, and instead have made this work, these courses for happiness and fulfillment, made those into yet another assignment, test, hurdle that they have to pass or conquer in order to be enough, in order to be good enough. And this is the life coaching lie, that you're not good enough just the way you are right now. Okay, that's the life coaching lie. And you'll also hear this in some of the old styles of psychotherapy, some types of CBT or ACT, or any kind of heavily cognitive therapy that basically tells you you're not good enough, and that instead you need to do X, Y, and Z, or ABC, or whatever, steps 1, 2, 3, whatever, in order to finally be good enough. And all of these life coaching and self-help and cognitive psychotherapeutic approaches are in contrast to the only approaches that are effective in the long term, which are a kind of experiential therapy. And a great example of that is IFS therapy, which I have championed in many episodes and am a certified practitioner myself. IFS being internal family systems therapy, which promotes has as a foundational assumption a radical self-acceptance. it's often helpful to also arrive at a kind of acceptance of the outer reality. And in the most literal, basic sense, it's always helpful to accept reality, because if you're in delusion or denial of reality, well, that's not going to be helpful. But even more than just the acceptance, mere acceptance, is within yourself to arrive at an experiential, emotional acceptance, not just an intellectual one, of yourself, of all of the parts of you. That's the one I'm going to be focusing on here, that concept, self-acceptance, radical self-acceptance. That however you and the parts of you are right now are just fine. That from the perspective of your higher self, they don't need to change. And as your higher self, you don't need them to change or even to do anything for you. Now, if they're in pain or distress and want to change, then of course you can, as your higher self, can help them to change, but you don't need them to change. I sat in on a reading group of a bunch of life coaches and kind of like toxic achievers. And one of the guys in the group used as an example to make the point, his point was that life is evil and human nature is evil. And he gave this example. For example, your child could be born with Down syndrome. And I was just floored by that. It made so many errors, this type of reasoning, this particular line of reasoning. One of which is to confuse tragedy with evil. But more importantly, let's just pause there on his remark about Down syndrome. And I find this to be a kind of background assumption in the unconscious of many practitioners of life coaching or fans of life coach gurus, which is that they might pay lip service to this idea of embracing vulnerability or something along those lines. But really what they're spending so much time and especially effort in is trying to become better, with the standard being relatively toxic. And one of those standards is achievement. So it's difficult for them to see, to recognize emotionally how someone could love and fully accept a person who has Down syndrome. I can give you a personal example from my own personal growth in this area over the many years. I have a nephew who is a teenager now, and he is a nonverbal autistic. And up until the age of 11, we didn't know how to really communicate with him. It turns out he is a genius. No kidding, he's a savant with photographic memory. But at 11 years old, we didn't know any of that. He was nonverbal, so I was already having as one of my motivations to put aside a trust fund for him to help care for him in his later life, because I assumed he wouldn't be able to take care of himself or to support himself. Of course, now he is enrolled in a degree program at Harvard, so he's doing incredibly well by any kind of achiever's standard. And the dangerous thing, and the thing that really is helpful for me to reflect on every now and then, is to remember what it was like to love him before he was able to communicate with us in any deep sense. At around 11 years old, he was introduced to a letterboard and became very proficient with it. And that just opened up a whole bunch of things that we didn't even know about of his inner life. And just remembering that all of this achievement that he's been able to accomplish in the last, less than 10 years, does not make him more worthy of our love or of love in general. And that's something that's really important to remember, because so many of us buy into the life coaching lie that we're more worthy because we've accomplished more or have developed more skills. Now, obviously, we might be more worthy of a promotion or of a job or of an A on the grade, on the test or the course, but I'm not talking about any of those. I'm talking about being worthy of love and acceptance and significance, that you are important just in who you are without needing to accomplish anything. And for those who've bought into the life coaching lie, and part of the reason why the self-help trap is so appealing to achievers is because it connects to their core insecurities and the lies they've been telling them, or that they were conditioned into and have been telling themselves since they were children, that they have to go and earn love, that they have to do, that love is conditional, and it's conditional on achievements or whatever conditions that they've adopted. Now, you might have parts right now as in you that you are ashamed of, that you wish weren't there. And maybe for the guys who are trying to get better with women, it might be the parts of you that are shy or that appear socially awkward or that are anxious. And you would pay a lot of money, and I know this for a fact, there are a lot of men who would be willing to pay or excise a lot of money to excise those parts of themselves for good, permanently. And I've been through this process. Of course, you can't pay to have that happen, but you can pay for knowledge and some training, and then just through hammering it over and over through experience, exile these parts of yourself. But here's the truth. That's just called repression. And it might work in the short term. Like I said, life coaching is great if you're just aiming for some kind of event in the next 3 to 4 months, and you don't mind sacrificing a whole bunch of parts of your personal life and of yourself in order to accomplish that goal. So maybe you've got a championship match coming up, and when it's those cases where you kind of just sprinting, or I guess is in a way it's kind of like a bounded marathon, it's going to end. You can give up sex or meeting with your wife and kids and whatever it is so that you can focus on the Olympics or something like that, right? So you got something like 3 to 6 months at the most. After 6 months, I've discovered most people, that toxic repression starts to eat away at them. And maybe if you only do it for 6 months or only do it for 1 year of your life, you'd be okay. And you can then after that go into the healing process and then have to make up for that toxic repression. But maybe that goal was worth it to you for some reason. But just realize that every time you do that, you are exiling, you're locking up in the basement of your mind those parts of you that are actually needing love and connection and attention and a hug and play and adventure and connection. So again, as an aside, I've been saying this from the beginning of this episode, but I want to just reiterate it. Life coaching is great if you're just focused on some goal in 3 to 4 months. So if, especially great for athletics or some sport. If you're gunning for the championship or you've got some big tournament coming up or some big fight coming up, if you're a fighter, life coaching is great for that. A great example of it that kind of encapsulates the whole thing is Tony Robbins, Tony Robbins is probably the premier life coach in the world, maybe in history in terms of life coaches. I think he had a lot of influence in the beginning, the creation of this life coaching industry. He might have even coined the term, but I'm not sure about that. But his event, Unleash the Power Within, his feeder event, like the first one that most people go into, and then he upsells you on the more expensive events during that feeder event. Unleash the Power Within is a ton of fun. And if you've never done it, I highly recommend it. And it's great because it gives, for many reasons, one of which is it gives you this, teaches you and kind of trains you to adopt this kind of physical energy. It helps you to control the energy that you have, your mood and your emotions, and literal energy in your body by manipulating your body, by just taking control of your physiology. But it's not sustainable in the long run. But if you just want a burst of energy to get you through the day, or to pull an all-nighter, or to get you through a really tough, audit week or something at work, then it's really helpful to have that in your toolkit. So I've walked on fire with Tony at the event, I think now 9 times in the span of, 4.5 years or so. And I'll do it again. It's a fun event. However, if you make your go-to, if like your default is to walk on fire, and you walk on fire all the time, and I don't get people who firewalk multiple times a week, and the firewalk that you do at the UPW event with Tony Robbins is relatively short, depending on which event. It varied in length, and sometimes I was walking on fire in hot and humid Singapore, and then walking on fire in the middle of winter with snow on the ground in London or New York or something like that. So those are quite different experiences. But I know people who walk on fire almost as a full time, like as part of their profession. They do it like every other week or so, and they'll do it for very long walks. You could just build up your tolerance for this sort of thing and become more skilled at it. And there's no question that as an athlete, you can build up your resilience. Or as a soldier in the military, if you're going to be in a deployment, life coaching is the way to go. It's not a good idea it's helpful to repress in crisis or emergency situations for relatively short periods of time. But just like if you became a career soldier always on the front lines, you're going to suffer from trauma. And of course, there's a well-known type now, PTSD, that is, the military cases are those are the textbook examples of PTSD. And you don't want to be suffering from PTSD for the rest of your life just because you unknowingly sacrificed these vulnerable parts of yourself for some burst of energy that you thought would only last for 3 months, but then you relied on that. And it's like I was saying, it's like making Red Bull your go-to drink in the morning. It's like you're drinking water, but you switch to Red Bull. And this ends up there's going to be a reason for why you're doing that, because you're trying to keep back other parts of yourself that would ordinarily burst out. And right away, if you are relying on repression, I know you're exhausted. You, as I'm speaking to you, the parts of you that are dominant and relying on repression will be exhausted as a result. But then underneath that are the parts that, when the exhausted parts rest, there are the parts holding fear, sadness, anger, deep desire for love and connection that are exiled with unmet needs. And those needs are being repressed so that you don't have to feel them. But they're still there. They're always there in the background. And that's part of the reason why there's so much exhaustion, because of all of the energy that has to go into keeping back those parts of yourself that would otherwise sabotage you. And for the average achiever, or for the beginner, which I think is almost everyone starting out in this, buying into the life coaching lie, there's the fears that you're trying to hold back. And the fear of failure, the fear of not meeting your potential, the fear of not being enough. And those are the three that I'm going to hit here, but there are many fears that's where that's where all the energy goes into repression, to hold back, to repress, to suppress, to hold back all of that fear. And along with that fear is, if you give into the fear, there's not just fear, but there's also sadness and anger and alienation and loneliness and all of these things that your protector manager parts just don't want to feel. They're afraid of feeling those things. So then they lean on the techniques, the strategies, and methods of life coaching to try to make it so that those parts of themselves never show up ever again. That obviously is toxic and is mentally unhealthy. You can see this if you follow the life coaching industry, which is still relatively young. If you follow it closely enough, you see the chinks in the armor and the cracking of their facade of keeping it all together. And I'm not going to name names. Besides Tony Robbins, that's an obvious one. But he's not all, hopefully I mentioned this, he's not all toxic. It's just part of his message. But I'm not going to name names because I'm also talking to them. And I want to give them grace and room to grow and change. And I also accept them. Again, it's part of a whole radical self-acceptance. Start with self-acceptance, and that will lead you to be able to see more clearly how to accept other things in life that are healthy to accept. And one is other people. If you actually are their friend, or if you're actually going to help them, you actually have to get to the point where you accept them for the way they are and don't need them to change, unless, of course, they want to change and you support that change. Then that's a separate story. But you don't need them to change for you to be connected to them or love them. That's actually what it means to love. And the therapeutic relationship, the relationship between a therapist and his client, begins from acceptance. So it's an ironic thing. Clients show up into the room or into the Zoom room wanting to change themselves. And right away, the therapist's attitude has to be that, to even get off the ground, has to be that they don't need to change. And it's easier when you're just the therapist. But when you are now siding with the client because the client wants this change, then because the client wants the change, you are now motivated to help them. But it's important to just realize and to remind yourself as a therapist, or for those who are life coaches who style themselves as, or fancy themselves as therapists, that it begins from a place of acceptance, a not needing of them to change, and returning to the example of children with Down syndrome or children, I gave the example of my nephew who is severely autistic, that I don't need him to change in any way for me to love him and for me to love him just the way he is, not needing him to get into Harvard or have photographic memory or do any of the other kind of achievement stuff that he's done, which I'm happy for him that he's proud of. I'm also relieved that he's going to be able to support himself and is able to communicate with others more easily and at a much greater depth. So that's all good news for practical reasons. But in terms of just my love or acceptance of him, that achievement doesn't change that. And if he were to have some, TBI, or if any of my loved ones were to have some kind of accident where they lost their faculties, if I really loved them, that would include acceptance of them for however they are. And my love for them wouldn't be contingent on their achievement. Do you struggle in your interactions with women or in your intimate relationship? Are fear, shame, or neediness sabotaging your relationships or attractiveness? In my Platinum Partnership Program, you'll discover how to transform your psychological issues, improve your success with women, and uncover your true self. Get access to all my current and future online courses by applying for the Platinum Partnership today at davidetiennephd.com/platinum. And that's the first fear. I want to base this on 3 different fears to organize this episode on 3 different fears. So that's the first one. The fear of failure, of making mistakes, the fear of losing, like in a competition. So I'll just encapsulate that as the fear of failure. And that fear of failure is what drives a lot of life coaching. And again, if it's for the short term and it's a burst of energy that you need every now and then just to get something done, and you're willing to repress or sacrifice for a little while, and it could be a day, it could be, it could just be an hour for some performance, or it could just be 3 months. Anything more than 6 months will now will have toxic downstream effects. But that fear of failure is if it's just to win at some competition that will be over in a couple months and then you never have to deal with it again, that's a good time for using life coaching. But if it's a way of life, as the way that many people use it as, and they create these elaborate morning routines as an example, like 2, 3, 4 hours before they get on with their day. And then just to start their day, they have so much stress because in order to be good enough as a human being, they have to become really good at all of these various things, fitness, meditation. They just add all of these things in before they even start their day. It's so stressful for them. And it's so exhausting for them. And they have to check all these boxes before they can even be good enough as a human being or to accept themselves so that they're not lazy. Because if they give in to their natural impulses of sitting around and doing nothing, then they're afraid that they'll become failures, right? So this is the normal way. So in their minds, those people who have bought into the life coaching lie, in their minds, it's either I'm going to become perfect or I'm going to be a total bum and a total zero and a total loser. And they're not aware of, well, first of all, that there is a part of you that is tempted to do that, and you're not listening to the one that wants to just kind of be lazy, because there's an important lesson there, which I'll get to in literally a few seconds, or I'll get to next. So this fear of failure, of losing, drives them to attend obsessively these life coaching events to the point where they don't even enjoy them anymore, but it feels like they're haunted. They have to go because they're not good enough just the way they are right now. And by God, I'm going to become good enough. If I go to enough of these events and walk on fire enough times, then I'll be able to burn off the sinful nature, so to speak, right? Like those parts of myself that I'm ashamed of, that I want to get rid of. And that is toxic. So hopefully, if you've been following my other episodes and my material for long enough, you can see how this is not mentally healthy. And of course, a great check for it is the concept that is the focus of this episode, which is self-acceptance. Do you accept yourself just the way you are fully without conditions? Now, again, if the part of you wants to change because it literally wants to, not because it's haunted to change, not because it's forced to change, not because it doesn't feel good enough unless it changes, but just maybe because just the way that like if you're sitting in one chair and it's kind of uncomfortable and you want to get up and switch chairs, you can do it. Like if you want to stop eating chocolate ice cream and you'd rather, I don't know, have vanilla, go for it. Right? So if it's like just a preference, or if it's just something that's more enjoyable, then that's an easy one. Just let them do it and maybe help them out of it. Or if they're in pain, if it's a painful place for them to be, then you as your higher self can help these parts of you that are in pain or distress to no longer be in pain or distress. But you as your higher self to know whether you are in the state of your higher self, check to see whether you need them to change in order for you to fully accept them. And if they're just fine the way they are, because you can love them just the way they are. And now, some examples. All parts are motivated to do something already. So part of the fear of the achievers who then pursue life coaching and buy into the life coaching lie, one of their fears is that they're not motivated to do anything, that they're afraid of just being lazy or getting into destructive behavior in the more extreme, like drugs or abusing substances or something. And they're worried that without the whip of life coaching, without the forcing of achievement, they're afraid that they'll fall back into nothingness and fail at life. But all parts are already motivated to do something that is enjoyable to them and healthy. But that this healthy motivation that is intrinsic to them has been either not accepted when you were younger, so you were made to feel that you had to be different, or not how you are, or how you were. You had to be different in order to be worthy of acceptance or attention or love or connection, most often by your parents or your caregivers, and sometimes by your peers or teachers. And as a result, those parts of you that had intrinsic motivation to do these enjoyable and healthy things instead were either repressed so that these healthy desires were warped into some other area, or they acted out, hence the destructive behavior, especially self-destructive behavior. But if you go through the therapeutic process, you will then led to encounter these inner child parts that you've been trying to repress and do away with, the ones that these protector parts of you might consider to be weak or vulnerable or shameful, and instead to look at them with full acceptance, as well as to look at the protector parts that are shaming with full acceptance and give them a big hug as well, and earning their trust, and then turning to the exiled ones that are holding the pain and are acting out. And if you get to, just like real children, if you really get to know them and give them a safe place and a secure attachment, then they'll let go of their self-destructive behavior and become them and more of them. And you'll discover that as they become more of themselves, that they're already intrinsically motivated to do something. And it's also part of the toxic nature of group education or childhood education, or like education for the masses, general education, where you're forced into a classroom of 20 to 30 or more students with one teacher, and the teacher just has to keep the chaos down. And in order to do that, you can't have these kids all, because you don't have one-on-one attention here, they can't all pursue what they all want to pursue. So you have to have a curriculum that works for everyone, like a cookie cutter, and you're forcing those little boys especially to sit still for hours on end, right when they are most motivated to get up and run and move and explore the outside world and everything. Anyway, I'm not going to get started or get too much into the toxicity of general education, but that's part of what has happened to our own child parts. And I'll give you as an example. I've used this example of my client Vic before, who was in a very conservative, achiever-driven community and culture in Asia that only respected, lawyers, doctors, and then increasingly engineers and the tech world. And he moved into the tech world, and his heart was totally not into it. And going through most of his 20s, he had as a part-time job woodworking. and he worked in various woodworking workshops, and he really loved it. And he then moved, because of the family pressures, societal pressures, he joined a startup that he demanded like 80 hours a week of his time. And he sold his soul and really to that job, and really missed his hobby, which was woodworking, that made his soul sing, so to speak, right? And it got to a point where luckily that startup failed, and he was forced to go back into the workplace. And so that's what he did. He got a job, and he was very employable, but his passion was still woodworking. And part of when he came to me, part of the work we were doing in his lifestyle was he really wanted to spend most of his time in his passion, and he thought he was good enough to strike out on his own and actually make a living off it. But none of his community or family or most of his friends did not support him, told him not to do it. So we came up with a relatively easy thing. You could take 6 months to a year, give it a shot. If it doesn't work out, you can go back into the workforce again. And what was amazing was he not only was able within a year to make enough from his woodworking that it exceeded what he was getting in the salary at the previous job. But even more important was how much happier he was and how much more alive he was. And then his dating issues got taken care of on their own, because he was radiating this joy and happiness in his life. And he was going to places that were around his passion, and to conventions around his passion, and meeting a lot of people who also shared his passions. So it was just so much easier for him to find connection. And he's now married with a beautiful child. And it came from the courage to face this fear of failure, of not, instead of just repressing that part of himself that had this useless hobby, according to everyone else in his life. And that can't make any money. And I realize the way I've just presented it seems like much more of a practical issue or a logistical one. But I'm really bringing this up because most of the struggle there was emotional. It was the struggle of decades-long repression from a repressive society and community and upbringing, to face the fear of being a loser in that context, to follow the parts of himself that were really speaking to him because he paid attention to it. Now, for many others, it could just be that you haven't even paid attention to it, so all you do is a kind of mind-numbing activity. So even just sitting and playing video games for hours on end in a kind of mind-numbing way, just to distract yourself. And this is the way that many people use porn. A lot of guys use porn, and they use it not out of that real pleasure. There's not relatively little intrinsic enjoyment for them in the use of it. Instead, they feel dirty and ashamed afterwards, and their eyes are bloodshot, and they're not energized by it to get on with the day. So if that's the case, if that's how these parts feel, if that's how you feel after doing that activity, then that's probably not the intrinsic motivation of those parts that are doing. Those are parts that are just acting out. And you won't learn about their intrinsic motivation, what they're really motivated to do, what they really want to do, what makes them feel alive. You won't really learn that until you attend to them, until you turn towards them with acceptance for how they are. And you learn about their pain and their stories and how they became this way and what they really want to do and the burdens that they're carrying. And until you help them to let go of those burdens, you won't really be able to discover what it is they really want. And then because of that, you as your system won't feel fully alive. And it might be the case that video games are your passion and you feel really great playing them. Then there's nothing wrong with that. I know a lot of old folks or old school people look down on video games, but man, you can make millions of dollars as a professional video game player these days. It wasn't the case in the 80s when I was growing up, or early 90s. There's very special circumstances like that you could do that. But now it's a much bigger industry. And I don't think parents should be dissuading their children from doing that if they're good at it and if they're really passionate at it. Okay, the second fear is the fear of not meeting your potential. And this I've come up against as a kind of secondary fear, it's kind of an excuse. So I'm just going to address that real quick here. The fear of not meeting your potential, as if there is this ideal perfection or this ideal you, that if you don't become this ideal you, then, I don't know, you're not good enough. And you got to beat yourself up real hard. You got to use the whip of life coaching to get to that ideal, because the pain of not meeting your potential is so great. Here's the thing. There's no such thing as meeting your potential. Be smarter about it. Here's an example, right, from physics, right? So already now in popular consciousness, that there is this idea, hopefully that's gotten out there, of multiple universes, different realities. And that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with counterfactuals. That's the term in philosophy. Counterfactuals. What would it be like if? What ifs? All of the what ifs. And the branching off of potential realities. So this, for you to feel bad about not meeting your potential, you would have to think that there's some kind of potential, like there's a one-dimensional route and you didn't get there. But actually there are thousands, if not millions, of potential yous that could have been instantiated, but were not in our reality. This is the you in this reality. There is a possible world in which I would have been a really good lawyer. I think I would have been a really good lawyer. There's also a possible world in which I would have been a good management consultant. Those two, lawyer and management consultant, have been sort of haunting me all the way through grad school as potential paths I could have taken. There's a me in a possible world that was a soldier in the military. My grandfather, my father before me were military men, career military beyond just conscription for a period of time. And I think I would have done well there, but I won't know because this is not the world that I happen to find myself in. But that's a possible world. There's a possible world in which I was a mediocre jazz musician. In high school, I majored in performance, saxophone performance in a performing arts high school. And I was really good, for that age, but I could see my limits. And I could have been good for my city or maybe my province. There is a possible world in which I was a good preacher, a pastor. I come from a long line of pastors, and much of my extended family are ordained ministers. There's a possible world in which I could have been a missionary trying to save the lost in some developing world or something like that. This is just endless. I could just go on and on and on. I'm using myself as an example because I know myself well. I'm sure you could come up with many possible worlds in which you could have your career. I just use jobs as an example, but I could have been a lawyer, but very different in many different possible worlds. You can see this is illustrated in an entertaining way in the MCU, the Marvel Universe. The recent Loki series did a really good job with that. All the different Lokis that were funny. There's a crocodile Loki. And there's a great book called Midnight Library that I read with a reading group that did a really good job also pointing out all of these different possible paths. These are real possibilities. And there's a whole science around it, around possible worlds. And you could spend all of your time, the rest of your life, studying modalities, these possibilities, necessity and possibility. So to think that there's one potential that you could have, and that if you don't have that potential, then if you don't fulfill that particular specific potential, then you're not good enough. It's just ridiculous. It's not even intellectually viable. It's a complete myth of this ideal you. There are just different yous. Some of them might have made more money. Some of them might have had more sex. Some of them might have lived longer. There's a possible me that died in a plane crash. There's a possible me that died in a motorcycle accident or that committed suicide successfully. These are possible worlds that I inhabited and that where the reality turned out different from how it is right now. Some of them I would, given how I am now, would prefer them rather than others. And maybe some of them I might have preferred aspects of them more than the current reality. I certainly would prefer to lose some of this fat that I'm carrying around my midsection right now. And if you want to say that if I had a six pack and made 10x more or 100x more, or had 100x more money or something like that, and that would be my ideal. There's something to that. I wouldn't say no to it. But would that be perfect? No, because there's always better. Why settle at 100? Why not 1,000x? Why settle at just a six-pack? Why not more muscles? Why settle at just muscles? Why not speed? Why can't I have better vision? literally with my eyes. Like, why can't I have better hearing? The sky's the limit. There is no ideal. There is no potential. There's just what you have and the choices that you make. And of course, there are possible worlds. There are possibilities, and all of them hold potential. But there's not just one potential. And if you don't meet that one potential, then you're not good enough. Okay, so this isn't clear to you. You just need to study more. You just need to think more and understand deeper about possible worlds. Okay, and then the third fear is the fear of not being good enough, of not being enough for love. And it's important that you realize if that's the fear that's driving you to use the whip of life coaching to repress parts of yourself out of fear that if you don't succeed in whatever arbitrary goal that you've given to yourself. And by the way, it's arbitrary. It's always arbitrary. So many guys don't realize how arbitrary their goals sound to me. Because it's like so many of them think, if I don't make $5 million, then I'm not going to be good enough. Why 5? Why not 50? Why not 500? Why not a billion? And then some guys kind of come up to me and say, I need to make $1 billion. Okay, why not 10 billion? Why not 100 billion? And then some people just, why money? Why not your body? Because it looks like crap. And then I'll meet a guy who's focused on his body and not his money. Okay, and then maybe I'll meet a guy eventually who focuses on every single potential thing, but that's impossible because there's always a trade-off. Then why don't you focus on being better at swimming? Why don't you measure your worth based on how well you play chess? Why don't you measure your worth on how well you speak Chinese? Like there could be a whole number of, an almost endless number of things that you use to judge yourself, whether you're good enough or not. And it's relatively arbitrary what you bought into as a child, really, which is where it almost always comes from your family, your community, your school, your peers, that you use now to judge whether you're good enough as a man or whatever it is. And some of you bringing up the one as a man. A lot of guys who find me on the internet are obsessed with being good enough for attractive women. And they're judging themselves and allowing women to dictate, or the mythical woman. They don't even really talk to real women, just what science says to them women want. And they use that, the faceless woman, the faceless attractive woman, the unreal, the non-real woman, as the judge of who makes them feel either enough or not enough. Your happiness, dude, is in the hands of it's not in your hands. It's in the hands of some faceless entity called attractive women. And it's being dictated really by some science textbook that says attractive women want this or that. And then you set that as your standard and you go and get that. And you think that when you finally get that, and this is true for all of these arbitrary goals that life coaching and anyone who follows that sets for themselves, whatever goal you think will finally make you enough so that you can finally rest, because finally you're enough. Whatever that goal is, it will not bring what you hope it will bring. It will not make you feel enough. It is not enough. It will never be enough. And even if it were enough temporarily, you're going to have to keep it. You're going to have to sustain it, because it's never just get it once. You're going to have to keep it going because it's for life, right? Because time continues. And you're going to have to keep that six-pack, or you're going to have to keep that money. And you know what life coaching will tell you? The great lie is that money is not good enough because you've got to keep growing it, because growth is what leads to happiness, which it's true in one sense. All of these are half-truths. So in some sense, they're true. It's true that watching or seeing progress can lead to happiness. It's not the only thing that leads to happiness, though. And if that's the only thing that you're counting on to lead you to happiness, you're really screwed. Right, so that's just one of many things. And it's nicer to see growth than not to see growth. It's nicer than seeing the opposite of it, the losing progress. But it would be even better if you didn't give a damn about whether you're making progress or not, and you're just fully accepting and happy with where you are right now. That's the great secret that is hidden away from life coach. I don't even think life coaches know that. They're so caught up in their own fears, and they pass them down to their clients and to their followers. Their own insecurities are writ large on their own messaging. And you can just tell what this person's, his demons and his insecurities and his shadows are based on his messaging or her messaging. It's what they're putting out there that they're they're so afraid. So for instance, the big three fears that I've brought up here, there are many of them. I just chose three. The fear of failure or making mistakes, the fear of not meeting your potential, the fear of not being enough. I can see these fears embedded or on the face of those life coaches and those followers of life coaches because of how they are, because the energy that they're using to fight off these fears. And that final one, the fear of not being enough, the way in which you go about trying to deal with that fear is conditioning in yourself that you don't love yourself. So if you care about happiness and fulfillment, not just about success or not just about worldly success, but you actually care about your happiness and finding love and connection. It, as you know, if you followed any of this material for long enough, you know that it requires loving yourself. Of course, loving yourself requires accepting yourself. I mean, love is a much bigger thing than just acceptance, but it's got to start with acceptance. That's the easiest gateway in. That's your foot in the door, your acceptance. The fact that you're doing so much to fight off the fear of not being enough is already telling yourself that you're not good enough. And as a result, that you don't love that part or those parts of yourself that you think are not enough right now, that you don't love them because you don't accept them. And that only when they change or when you can change them or when you can get rid of them, then you'll be worthy of love. Well, guess what? You're telling yourself unconsciously. You're telling yourself that you're not worthy of love. All of these fears are what drive, all of these fears and many other fears are what drive the agenda of life coaching. If you buy into it, it's the great lie that will hurt you in the long run. So just to recap, the fear of failure and mistakes and loss, the fear of not meeting your potential, the fear of not being enough are what are behind. These three fears and many other fears are behind the life coaching lie and the self-help trap. And if what you are really after is long-term consistent happiness, fulfillment, and meaningful success that's enjoyable to pursue, then you're going to have to take seriously this idea of radical self-acceptance and really embrace it. Because if you don't, then all you're going to have is an unsustainable energy of repression leading to burnout if you're lucky, or if you're not, leading to an unhealthy, toxic repression there in the background, exhausting you, where you would feel tired, just closing your eyes and just feeling into those parts of you that are feeling like they're not enough. Those needs are not being met by this repressive energy of striving. I've experienced all of these fears myself. This is how I know it so intimately. For most of my life, I pursued the life of an achiever, the strategy of an achiever. So I took very easily to life coaching. I was a natural with it. Like I said, I still love it. I love going to these life coaching events where you jump up and down and you scream at the top of your lungs and you walk on fire. It's a high. It's a hoot. I love it. But I know that, and hopefully you are aware now, that is not a sustainable energy and it will lead to burnout. But it's a great tool to have in your toolkit to use every now and then when you need a short burst sprint to some deadline. But this is not something to rely on as a default, and it's not something that can bring you consistent happiness or fulfillment. And if that's what you want, happiness, long-term happiness and fulfillment and consistent, enjoyable success, come to the next episode. I'll be covering how to actually get this radical self-acceptance. How do you do it? And I'll be using some case studies to illustrate that over the next couple episodes. I hope to see you in the next episode. And thanks so much for listening to this and any other episodes you've been listening to. Thanks for listening to this podcast. If you like it, hit like on whatever platform you're at, give it a rating on Apple Podcasts, and share it with anyone that you think would benefit. Thanks so much for listening. I hope to see you in the next episode. Until then, David Tian signing out.